Hello, and welcome to Research the News. This week, we're talking about transgender athletes with a gender studies professor from West Virginia Wesleyan College. And as always, we're live, so there'll be no edits if you're listening to the podcast the next day. And with that being said, I'm going to bring on my co-host. Hey, Gretchen.
Hey, Ray, how's it going?
Going well. So this is actually your former professor, right?
Actually, my former colleague.
Oh, wait a second. I actually this whole time thought it was your professor.
No, we taught at West Virginia Wesleyan College together.
Interesting.
And she was she was kind of floating in and out of gender studies and music, and she's an amazing musician. And so that's how I got to know her, because I was in the theater and the dance department.
Nice. Well, I might have to bring up the music with her because I did not know that. So this is good. All right. And last week we talked about disagreeing without hating each other. And you can view that in our web pages. I actually was hitting a little bit of a fever by the end of our conversation on Monday. So I didn't post up that night like we normally do. So if you're waiting for it on Tuesday morning, it was a little bit delayed, but it's up there now. researchthenews.org, researchthenews.com. They have all of our links. And as always, when you look at the show today, if you go to researchthenews.org, all of the articles that we're talking about are posted there. And if there's anything new that we talk about, we'll post that up after the show is over. So with that being said, let's bring on Jess Scott. Hey, Jess, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Doing
Hi,
well.
Jess.
Now that I know you're a musician, this is new. We'll have to talk about that. We'll save it for afterwards. But I do want to find out more about that. So today we're talking about transgender athletes, and we're going to start out with the game we always like to play. What's your bias? So we'll start out. Let's start with Gretchen on this one. So what's your bias when we're talking about transgender athletes?
So I'm a dancer, primarily for my work. I better be specific about that. I'm a teacher and an educator and a professional dancer. I've danced professionally for the last, I'm going to date myself, since 2004. So that's a long time. And I am plugged into the LGBTQ community through my dance friends. My teaching, for sure, at West Virginia Wesleyan College, and my liberal bias takes me to a place of empathy with struggles that LGBTQ people are dealing with.
Cool. I'll go next, and then we'll wrap up with Jess here. So typically when it comes to this conversation, I'm very open to hearing different opinions than what I have. My first thought, it goes to fairness, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And I do think there are biological differences between men and women, and I think those are minimized when there's testosterone reduction surgery, but there's some things that I don't think can be changed. And so my bias is towards trying to find a solution that I will be very clear about that I don't have, that I would like to talk about tonight, and hopefully find something where we could move forward where it's fair for everyone involved. There's no one that gets left out, but also too that we don't take something away from athletes who were biologically female when they were born. So I'm open to hearing different viewpoints. I'm looking forward to hearing different viewpoints. And as far as sports go, this is something that Jess and I talked about. I did play sports growing up. I was not a star athlete. I didn't get a college scholarship. I was actually pretty scrawny. That's a kind of a side note, but I was 16 years old and I was still 6'4" like I am now, but I was about 165 pounds and I could not put on weight. So my testosterone apparently hadn't kicked in yet. So I was severely undersized. So luckily when I played football, I was at a class A school. So I played tight end and defensive end, where anywhere else had been like a kicker, but I at least got to, play on the field. So that's my bias. And Jess, you're up.
Well, as Ray said, I'm a gender studies professor, so I suppose that has to be one of my biases right off the bat. I identify as queer, so I'm a queer person myself, but I'm cisgender, and so coming to this conversation, I don't know what it feels like to be transgender. So I think that really matters in terms of not knowing exactly how damaging transphobia can be. But I do have a lot of transgender friends and people that I love and care about. So I'm thinking of them and their dignity as human beings when I come to this conversation. And I have to confess that I care very little about competitive professional athletics. I do think that athleticism and participating in sports is really, really wonderful part of being a human being. And it's great for your health, both physical and mental. But the competitive part of it, I just don't really care for. I do play tennis. I'm a tennis player.
Oh,
But I
nice.
don't really watch competitive sports. And I think that, yeah, in terms of, y'all also named sort of your political positions. I guess I consider myself probably left of progressive. And I think that mostly has to do with wanting everybody to have their basic needs met so that everybody can live at the same level of dignity, really. And so that's kind of what informs my politics. I do care a lot, even if I don't care about sports, I do care a lot about women's opportunities, and I'm a feminist. So all of those things definitely inform how I think about this issue.
Sounds good. And we're going to have two things. Number one, I just started playing tennis last year, so if you need a partner, I'm really enjoying it. So if this doesn't go completely off the rails and you don't hate me afterwards, maybe we can play tennis. Also, just for viewers, so we like to make sure if we're talking about a term that may be familiar to us but not other people, cisgender is just if you identify as the sex you were born. So if I'm cisgender because I'm a male who identifies as I was born male and I identify as a male. Did I say that? You're the gender studies professor. Did I say that incorrectly? Was that
No,
an
you
accurate
didn't say that
statement?
correctly.
Perfect. All right. But yeah, so any of those terms where it might seem normal to us, let's just make sure we're going to define them, and I'll do the same thing when it comes to sports. So if there's something I say that you don't know what I'm talking about, feel free to stop and ask. So, okay. And right now we're going to start off, we're about to get into the topic, but before we do, we want to talk about a position that doesn't necessarily align with typical stereotypes of what you've heard from us so far. So I, for example, am a conservative, and I think oftentimes when you hear a conservative viewpoint about transgenders in sport, transgender people in sports, it's a very negative one. It's very angry. It should never happen. And I think, to me, one of the things that really affected me when I was reading through, I think there are going to be a lot of disagreements that you and I have, Jess, but there is a disagreement that I hope no one has that's listening to this. I was reading the story about Annette Nagisa. She's an athlete from Uganda who was born with internal gonads. I'm learning all kinds of scientific things this week, so that's a real thing. She was intersex, and she was producing too much testosterone, which disqualified her from some sports. So her doctor suggested she had surgery to remove those, which is a big thing. And she still wasn't able to compete afterwards. But the big thing that hit me was that she said in the article I was reading that she couldn't return back home to Uganda when that was released because LGBT individuals were openly condemned, and she would have been imprisoned or killed when she went back to Uganda. So that was something. I mean, she didn't change her sex. She was born intersex, and even that would lead to imprisonment or death in her country. And I feel like those are the kind of things that often get lost in these conversations, that we're talking about real people here. So whether we think Annette should be or shouldn't be raising, that's a completely different topic from her, existence, which is often threatened. So that's my, I think, non-stereotypical viewpoint. And Gretchen, do you want to go next?
I was trying to think of something, and Ray kind of put me on the spot right before we started to go on air. I think it's interesting. I think I have little libertarian things in the backs of my head, maybe not more conservative, but more when I think it's maybe more just where I intersect with people in the center. So it's almost like, I intersect more with a libertarian viewpoint of deregulation when it comes to people. So I want to live my life, and I want people to live their lives without feeling like they're being litigated and their bodies being litigated. And I think that actually plays true for this conversation. And that's a very libertarian viewpoint, which I never thought I would ever venture into libertarian viewpoints, but maybe that just is where I intersect more into the moderate realm of politics.
We've got you away from Antifa and towards the moderate view. That's my goal for the show.
This is a joke. This is a joke, everyone.
I'm not sure. I actually, I don't know if we can joke about Antifa now. So
I don't think you can.
yeah. Jess, your turn. Something that doesn't necessarily align with progressive or liberal beliefs in general that you might want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about my experience of living as a rurally located person. So I live in rural West Virginia. And I think that rural America is often a very scary place in the imagination of liberals. And I think that actually there's been a lot of harm in the way that the sort of liberal progressive narrative has become like a city-based, city-focused narrative. So I think I care very deeply about rural people in places that are often kind of dismissed as Trump country. So I guess I would say that, but also along with what Gretchen said, and I think that this could also be an anarchist position, but it's something that could be shared across the political spectrum, which is just the absolute failures of the state in terms of sort of, yeah, in terms of the deregulation, I guess, of their constant interference with our bodies and wanting to sort of dictate who we can be. Yeah, I definitely don't like any of. I think a lot of times the liberal approach is to advocate for more like non-discrimination law or things like that, and honestly I don't think those things work. And I think there's got to be a different way. So the state, I think, has failed in those ways.
I agree.
I love it. I think that's great. I think actually a lot more people are libertarians sometimes get a bad rap, but I think when you actually look at what, if you don't look at the stereotype of what a libertarian believes, I feel like most people kind of are like Ron Swanson in a way from Parks and Rec, where it's just like get government out of here. I'm always,
I want my steak.
Yeah, I want to live my life and I don't want to be interfered with by the government. I think a lot of people can get behind that, so that's great. And as we move forward, if you hate any of what we just said or what we are going to say, just feel free to keep listening, because at least you'll understand hopefully where we're coming from, even if you hate what we're saying. So, okay, so we're about to get into the conversation, and before we do, the last definition, Jess, do you just want to talk to us about your definition of transgender and just setting that boundary for this conversation?
Sure. I was just going to explain it as all of us are assigned a sex at birth, and there's an assumption about the gender that we'll grow into based on that assignment of sex. For a lot of people, like Ray mentioned earlier, that assignment is pretty comfortable throughout their lives. And so those folks would be cisgender, like you're assigned female at birth, you identify as a woman, as an adult. That's a cisgender gender identity. Transgender is actually an umbrella term for lots of different ways of experiencing gender, and some of those are sort of called non-binary, which means you may be between sort of masculine or feminine, but that transgender generally means that assignment that was given to you at birth based purely on the appearance of your genitalia, because babies aren't tested for chromosomes or anything like that. That assignment is not comfortable for you. And so you grow into your gender in a different way than cisgender people do. And so the trans relationship means that, yeah, you've got a different relationship to your gender than what the doctors sort of predicted for you when they assigned your sex at birth.
All right. I think it's a great overview, and I think that can lead right into this. So, I think to start out, one of the things that we talked about before we went on air were just some of the specific issues you had. And one of the things you brought up, because you seemed pretty excited to talk about this, which we went through a few different topics we could talk about, and this one seemed to really stick out to you. And I think it has been in the news lately. President Biden signed an executive order to make sure that transgender women were allowed to participate in sports. And currently there's a lot of different laws, and they seem to be changing all the time. But basically what it typically comes down to, and again, feel free to correct me if you have a different understanding, Jess, but typically any of these regulations come down to how much testosterone women are producing. It used to be, so I read through the history of this, in the 30s, it started out when women's sports were just kind of coming to the forefront. It was just a genital check. They actually just took off people's clothes to make sure that they were the right gender. And then it went and they started doing more different kinds of testing, and it's kind of evolved now to the point where they do testosterone levels. Is that, in your mind, the correct statement here for how transgender athletes are judged?
I think so. And then, I mean, internationally, the athletes are not tested. Women, this only affects athletes competing in the women's category, but women aren't sort of universally tested. It's only when someone else questions their gender, because the IAAF decided to not do that testing. But in the case of, for instance, Caster Semenya, other runners said, like, are we sure she's a woman? And so I think that part of it is that it's like based on the perception of another person's gender. Yeah, but that's what it's about.
I think that's a good way to start. So I think one of the things we don't want to do here are use extreme examples to make a case for everything. But I think talking about some specific examples, and Caster Semenya, I think is a good example because it's a very publicized case. And again, all the links are up on researchnews.org. But if you want to talk a little bit about the Caster Semenya case, and I know you'd done some research into her situation, and kind of talk to us about some of the issues you see with how either she was treated or the whole system in general.
Yeah, she's a runner from South Africa. She's very fast. She always understood herself as a girl. She identifies as a woman. And then in a competition that I think was in Germany in 2009, there was a question about her gender. And so she underwent some testing. They were supposed to keep that testing confidential. I think one of the ethical issues is that it leaked that she was being tested. And so already there's this sort of controversy then surrounding her, as she runs. And she won that race. She's also won at the Olympics. She's gone sort of in and out of competing in response to different international athletic bodies trying to make decisions about what should happen to her, and by extension, what happens to other intersex women. But again, it's like only women who don't conform to a sort of conventional definition of femininity. And although it's funny to say that in the case of athletes, I think, because they work so hard on their bodies that it's like, they're likely to appear more masculine anyway, when they're competing at an elite level. But that Caster was singled out. We don't know what the testosterone levels were of all of the other women who were in that race, that initial race, or the later races. And it was people this is kind of similar, I think, to the case with the transgender girls in Connecticut. It was people she beat, who were saying, like, oh, test her. Are we sure she's a woman? And obviously, being a Black woman, and historically, we don't have time to go into all of this, but definitions of femininity cohering around whiteness and what it means to be sort of like a lady, those things really seem to have been weaponized against her. And so I guess the issue for her is she's fast, she's a woman, but they decided against her in the most recent decision, I think in 2018. And so she's not supposed to run anymore, compete anymore internationally.
And I think that's an important discussion that I think sometimes gets dismissed by people who are for transgender athletes in sports. And I think, so the testosterone level, I tried to find that out, and here's what I could find. And I did some research about these numbers in general. I also found out what nanomoles per liter means, because that's apparently how these are all measured. So typical female levels of testosterone are between 0.3 and 2.4. Typically, though, they're on the much lower end of the scale. If it gets higher, from what I've read so far, is that sometimes that could mean you have some kind of cyst or some kind of medical issue. One of the articles you posted that was from Scientific America that mentions trans girls belong in girls sports teams. I think the author brought up false equivalency. He said that there are women who have things like PCOS, and I forget what that stands, but polycystic ovarian syndrome.
Polycystic, yeah.
Yeah. And he said that, well, that doesn't count. And that actually, even if you have that syndrome, it's still 1.2 to 2.5 nanomoles per liter. So the IAF used to be at 5 nanomoles per liter as the barrier. Now they raised it recently, I think it might have been after that 2018 decision, to 10 nanomoles per liter. So that was she had to be at least 10 or above, and men typically are anywhere from 7.7 to 29.4. So that's a pretty wide range. So to basically summarize it, typically women are on the much lower end, under 1. Men at 7.7 probably wouldn't have much. They would probably need to have some kind of testosterone booster. That's very low, and that's typically if you're later in life. But I mean, men go up to 29. So we have a range from 29 to 1. And it does work, especially when people are forming their bodies. That's when it affects growth and some other things. And then once that's taken away, there are a lot of effects from the testosterone that are gone. But there are some that are kind of lingering and stay on. So you can't, for example, I'm 6'4". That's partially because of the testosterone I had. You can't change the fact that I'm taller, and in general, men are larger people. So that being the baseline, that comes down to kind of the issue. And that's where I think one of the things you said, Jess, when we were talking before, was that people say women's sports exist because women wouldn't be competitive. And correct me if I'm quoting you incorrectly here, but you said that Title IX actually gave women the opportunity to participate. It wasn't because of ability. It was more that they were just being excluded. But so I guess my question to you is, do you think that on a biological level, knowing there's differences there in testosterone, muscle mass, there's a lot of biological differences, do you think that women would naturally be able to compete with men, and it's a system that holds them back? Or do you think there are biological differences between men and women that actually do hold women back?
Definitely Title IX gave women the opportunity to compete because they just weren't allowed to.
They just weren't allowed to, yeah.
And so that's a thing you can see. I mean, you can see that sort of like women weren't allowed to compete before, and now they can compete because there's Title IX.
Mm-hmm.
I read this really interesting article, and this is the view I would love to hold. But I don't know enough about, I can't get myself to care enough about the level of competitiveness to research this fully. And so I'm sure that like there's a lot that's out there that I don't know about. But I tried to find this article and I couldn't. I think I might be able to find it later and send it to you. Where the author talks about like, okay, we had all of this time where women weren't participating in athletics for cultural reasons. It wasn't ladylike to do, whatever.
Right.
We've had how many, like what's 72, so 50 years of, around 50 years of Title IX. Have we, as women, continue to compete and compete more, will they get faster, stronger? Will those I guess it's sort of an evolutionary argument. Like, will you adapt and become sort of faster and stronger? I'd love to sort of aspirationally, I hold that view where it's like we would have to wait and see. We have not seen a world where men and women have competed on level playing field. I guess that's where the snag is for me. Like, I get the thing about the testosterone, and I do understand the there are differences. Not only when we're focusing on gender, we see those differences as gender differences, but individually our bodies are so varied that there are huge differences individually between different bodies. And so what would it look like? What would it look like if Title IX hadn't been necessary? What would it look like? So I don't know. I really can't say definitively about that, but Title IX definitely did give women the opportunity to participate. And I do think that that's the political terrain on which these debates are unfolding, because with transgender girls in athletics, it's obviously about sort of like protecting women's sports.
Yeah. No, and I think I totally agree that hopefully eventually, I mean, that is something that's brand new and recent, but eventually I think women can get there. I wanted to look up some of the effects of testosterone in the body and some of the long-term advantages. So often, I mean, the average height of men and women in America, 5'9" to 5'4". There's maximum oxygen consumption which is different. VO2 max, it's typically about 20% difference. Bone mass is anywhere from 26 to 45. That actually was interesting to me. I read a study from the NIH where the bone mass in identical, or not identical twins, fraternal twins, I guess it is, where they
Fraternal when they're separate.
yeah, there you go. Their bone mass density was between 26 to 45% higher in the males. So this was pretty accurate testing.
Significant.
And then obviously more muscle mass. So in general, men, this was from a British study, they had 33 to 21 kilograms of absolute muscle mass, but also relative body muscle mass was typically 38 to 30%. So there's a lot there that happens. And some of that goes away when you're off testosterone, but some of it doesn't. And I think that's the part where you talk about leveling the playing field. One of the things that's one of the exceptions to the rule I learned was that extreme distance running, that's one where the biological differences totally give way once you stop taking testosterone. And men and women typically, even without any kind of testosterone changes, they typically compete because women after a certain distance are able to process body fat better, which gives them more endurance in extreme, 50, 60-mile races. So there's definitely a difference there. And I think it's pretty interesting to me. And this is my next question to you is, I personally do think there's a difference between men and women's bodies. And I know right now that all of the professional sports that are out there, men can't play in WNBA, but there is no sport that is not open to women. And every time I've seen a woman compete, I remember growing up with Manon Rome, for anyone who remembers her. I was one of my first crushes. I was like 12 years old and she was a goalie for the Tampa Bay Lightning in their training camp. And people were excited, and they were excited that women could potentially play at that level. And no one's played yet in the professional leagues, but they are not closed off. So it's something, if you're listening to the show and not familiar with sports, they're all open to women. There just hasn't been a woman who's taken place. So I think the debate often comes down to transgender athletes that are male to female, and it doesn't seem to be the opposite way. So if it's not about skill levels and biological changes, what does that say to you, Jess, that why there's a problem for transgender women playing women's sports and not, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I've missed, but I haven't seen any issues with transgender women playing or transgender men playing men's sports.
It's funny because I just saw a story about, I think this was a high schooler, transgender man who was a wrestler and who was winning all the wrestling matches. And it was interesting to me. Yeah, well, I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, you're right. But I think that is also the case internationally. Like there's no one's going around measuring men's testosterone levels. No one's going around policing men's gender in relation to athletics. The assumption is that if you are a man, you are better, faster, stronger
And that's
in
not necessarily,
athletics.
yeah.
And I didn't actually know that the all the professional leagues were open to women, but I cannot imagine wanting to be like the only woman on a team competing or the only woman. I just am thinking what the dynamics are at play.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying I don't know that we could know until gender is less
Stigmatized.
important to us,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know, but yeah, you're definitely right. The issue is around always around women's sports, and there's a very long history of using sort of saying that we want to protect women from different other individuals, whether this is, if you think in the case of lynching of Black men, using white women to say that Black men are dangerous and that lynching is justified in an earlier time. Or if you think about the bathroom bill, that especially the most publicized one, I think, was in North Carolina in 2015. But if you think about the way those bathroom bills are talked about, it's always like framed as we have to protect women in the bathrooms as private area from men, men
Yeah.
in dresses, which is a deep misunderstanding of what it means to be transgender anyway. And so to say that trans women can't be in the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity because they're a threat, or to say that um, any transgender person who wants to woman who wants to compete is automatically going to be better than the other women on the team is, to me, an extension of that same sort of like saying we're protecting women, we're protecting cisgender women um, from particular men that we want to stigmatize at this time, or transgender women. There seems to be a very clear obsession with the binary, maintaining the binary, gender binary here. And I think one of those articles mentioned, I think it was the, correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but the International Olympic Committee, part of their rule was that you have to get the surgery, the
Yeah.
gender confirmation surgery to be able to compete. But that is a surgery that's only about the genitals.
Yeah.
And that does not affect athletic competition. So how can they say that this is only about an advantage in sports or an advantage in terms of athleticism if they're also saying like, well, your genitals also have to look right.
Yeah.
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 I tend to look at it almost like it's like a like that strict father morality that kind of runs through our society. It's making people live the way that one part of our society feels like they should live. And I think this goes along a lot of different issues that have come up in our history, whether it be abortion or, oh my gosh, like you could go further back and interracial marriage or, so, and even just blacks not being able to eat in white restaurants and things like that. It's legislating and putting into place things that will control people in the way that the very small minority, which some of the things that I've read, there is overwhelming support for LGBTQ to live their lives the way that they need to live their lives. So I don't think this, and even one study showed that it was dead last on conservatives' thought process of things that mattered to them. So I think whenever we look at how this is moving through our society right now, it's coming through legislatively through Republicans, in very rural, middle, even North Carolina has a little bit more population, but these areas where I don't know, it seems like they're just trying to force it on people rather than allowing like time to pass. Like I think this is the big thing. There aren't enough people for us to make a decision about what's right and wrong right now because there aren't enough people going through the process and competing for us to even see what the real world implications are and the implications on student athletes is right now because there are not very many people doing it.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate for both
Please do.
things each of you said, and then something that I think conservatives typically said. Going back to the surgery you were talking about, Jess, I think that was with Annette, who I mentioned earlier, and it seems questionable to me whether that was required from, right now there's no surgery required from the Olympics, but it seemed like it was a local doctor, so would want to look into that a little bit more, but I don't think it was coming from the Olympics, but I could be wrong there. But with your comment, Gretchen, about Republicans, I think often Republicans get blamed for this, but there are a lot of very liberal women. And I learned some new terms over the past couple of years, including TERF and SWERF. And I know TERF is trans exclusionary radical feminist, and SWERF is, which is SWERF, Jess?
Sex worker exclusionary.
That's it. Sex work, like Leslie Knope, for example. We brought up Parks and Rec. I actually watch that show now, and I think at the time she was a feminist hero, and she talks a lot about how she's not in favor of sex work. So she would be a SWERF. She would not even be a full feminist to some people. So there's a lot of women that come out and say they might be liberal in every aspect of their lives, but they say this is an issue that matters to me, and I don't think transgender women should be playing sports, and they are cast out as outsiders and they cast out with the crazy Republicans. Now, Republicans, going back to your point, Jess, I agree that oftentimes like the issue gets caught up of what about the man in the dress in the bathroom, and what about someone who goes through and just plays sports just because it is a low number right now. I think there's two parts to that. Right now, that's not an issue because it is about the levels of testosterone, and while I look back at myself at 18 years old, and if I had the opportunity to get a college scholarship, I was very poor growing up. If I played women's sports, maybe it would have gone through my mind for a second. But number one, I don't think I would have been able to do it in general, just because that's not I don't know. I feel like, for lack of a better term, I was too macho at 18. And two, to actually go through and have testosterone reduction, that's a whole nother level. That's not dressing up as a
Yeah.
woman or just saying. I think the key, though, is what we got to watch out for is that I often hear things like that's not an issue now. And no one wants to talk about the slippery slope. The concern is if you start making it about, because there are some people, I listened to a great podcast today about this, and the woman who was transgender, she had gone through the transition. She knew there were biological differences and there should be balances. But some people are like, no, if you just identify, you're good. And I think that's the part where I kind of draw the line. If someone actually wants to go through surgery and has the right hormone levels, I'm all for them playing, but I do think, and that's the part too that comes back to competitive versus non-competitive, because if we're talking about non-competitive sports, I've played in a bunch of co-ed teams, men and women, and I love it. And if it's about that kind of non-competitive competition, there's a lot of those options out there, but that's where the competitive side of it comes in, where I think it's difficult. And the last thing I'll say to wrap up on just kind of the differences here, this is, again, you don't want to use the crazy far out example, but there haven't been that many transgender women in professional sports. Fallon Fox was one of them. She's a MMA fighter. Have you guys seen the videos of her fights?
No, I saw your link though.
So this is where it gets a little tricky, because even if I think that Fallon Fox should be able to play, to be able to be an MMA fighter, that's where I get really difficult to me. We're not talking about non-contact sports here. We're talking about MMA. And she was a former Marine who transitioned to being a woman. And I watched the fight. This was actually a couple months ago. Someone posted a copy of the fight, and it was brutal. And she broke this woman's orbital bone. There's differences. There's a lot of different versions of what she actually broke. But she has a tweet that stated, "For the record, I knocked 2 women out because someone said, I literally just read you've smashed 2 women's skulls open. You think you have the right to say anything about anyone." And she responded by saying, "For the record, I knocked 2 out. 1 woman's skull was fractured, the other not. And just so you know, I enjoyed it. See, I love smacking up turfs in the cage who talk transphobic nonsense. It's bliss. Don't be mad." I feel very uncomfortable with that. And I think that's something that's a little bit tricky for me, because typically I tend to come from a very logical perspective. And so if she was okay to fight and the woman was okay fighting her, everything in me says, okay, like she went in, fought, they all agreed to it, and she won. But then when she says, as someone who transitioned, who's stronger, who has the benefit of a lot of testosterone throughout her life, more muscle mass, to say that she loved breaking open someone's skull, that's where it gets a little tricky. And I go, okay, even if I'm agreeing with this, as a man, I could never see myself hitting a woman. And so when I see this here, it gets tricky for me, because even though she identifies as a woman now, she still has that body mass advantage, that bone mass advantage, the height advantage that she had from being born and raised a man. So I feel like that's a tough one. And again, I don't want to get focused on the extreme cases, but does that make you feel uncomfortable, Jess? Or do you think that, again, it was everyone agreed to it and we're good?
I'm gonna say, again, as a person who cannot bring myself to care about this, when I hear that tweet, like, I don't like that type of sort of aggressiveness, but that to me goes with the fighting.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's culturally MMA is a culture that produces that attitude to me. And so I think it's a lot, the discomfort for me is in the sort of like wanting to beat people up in the first place, which if you're in that cage, you want to beat people up.
Yeah.
So
Right.
like that for me is the issue, not the issue of like, and I mean, never mind.
It almost feels like it's something maybe
I
that
feel well. I
there could
wouldn't
be
even
like an
you don't.
unwell.
You don't have to say the never mind, but don't be. I mean, if you're worried about offending me or something, feel free to offend me. This is okay, because I love hearing those never mind questions. So, but sorry, go ahead, Gretchen.
I'd like to smack J.K. Rowling, but you know,
Oh, there you go. See,
that's just a theoretical, you know.
Yeah.
As a TERF, she's been a very vocal TERF, but I did find that IOC on the Olympic Committee website, and it does say that part of it's among other things, the hormone therapy, but part of it is the genitalia changes. They are included. And to me, it's just sort of like, if it's all about testosterone and it's really about the competitive advantage, requiring the cosmetic alterations to the genitalia, it's not about that. It's about making a
overkill.
clear, it's
Yeah.
about making a clear distinction between what is a man and what is a woman.
Yeah.
And there was another piece. Oh, what you were saying about, like, if when you were in high school, if you were imagining a scholarship, um, I have had students, this was a huge topic this year in class, and they were talking about, like, don't you worry that, like, men are gonna, like, boys are gonna infiltrate, like, girls' sports, and I said to them, I said, please find me the high school boy that would like to be a girl for the benefit of winning a competition. Because when you can bring me that child,
Right.
I will be like, I will relent.
Wow,
but
right.
like, I'm just trying to imagine. I mean, what you described as macho, I think, is like the extreme pressure on boys to be masculine, to be tough. And in sports language, to do something like a girl is to do it badly.
Yeah.
So like, you're not going to be proud of, being like a girl, being on a girls' team and like beating a bunch of girls. It's like, that means you can't run with the boys. Like, there's a whole thing about, and I think that's kind of what you were talking about with the distinction between somebody who wants to transition and somebody who's just sort of like infiltrating the sport. But I also think that, similar to what Gretchen was saying, I think that the boy who wants to infiltrate girls' sports is a sort of specter, like a threat.
It's a made up.
It's a potential. It's a what am I thinking? Like it's a threat that doesn't really
A red herring?
exist.
A red herring.
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah,
But,
it's like this made up thing that
the-
doesn't really exist. Yeah.
But that's where in the 1930s, and the also the sort of like World War II, Cold War era, like the whole fear of the infiltration of women's sports by men was because we didn't want communists to beat us. So it was like, well, we have to keep these mannish Eastern European women out of sports because how do we know they're not men? And the assumption there, to me, I guess what I really care about in this topic is that the assumption is that men are like always faster, stronger, and that comes from testosterone. And I honestly don't know if we know enough. I love to read feminist scientists, and they always talk about the problems with the way that a lot of scientific research about the human body, but also about sort of animal organization, has been read through like a human social lens. And so a lot of the ways that people, a lot of the science that we have inherited has kind of focused on gender, as in like, is there a gender difference? Let's see. If there is, let's publish it. If there's not, we'll just leave that part out. They've studied that in neuroscience, and math is another area where the assumption was always sort of that like boys are better than girls. Is there a math gene that boys have? And time showed that all those test scores that looked like there was a huge gap, pre-Title IX, however you want to describe it, they closed over time. And so I understand that math and athletic ability are very different. But
yeah, no,
I
and
wonder,
I think,
like, if you look at, oh, sorry, right, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I think I try to do a lot of research into, is there actually a difference? And one of the things that really stuck out to me, the IAFF, because there's a lot of hypothetical things, and you'll see a lot of catchy headlines. The women's national soccer team lost to a boys high school team once in Dallas 8 years ago, and people use that as an example of why women's sports aren't as good. But when you look into it, they won some, they lost some. It was a scrimmage. It wasn't really hardcore playing. But when you look at the actual data from the IAF, I like how you said the IAAF. I don't know if that's true, how it's pronounced, but it sounds cool to me, so I'm going to use that. When you look at the best women's results in, say, the 100-meter race, the best women's result in 2019 was 10.71 seconds. The best boys' result, under 18, so that's all women of all ages, was 10.15. And now it's funny because when I'm not an Olympic athlete, typically all of the men, even someone like Usain Bolt, which he has an amazing time, he's still all the other competitors with him are well within a second. There's just microseconds of difference. There were 124 boys who beat the best women's record of anyone under 18 who weren't fully developed beat all of the women's records. When you go out into the general population, for example, the 100 meters, those numbers change pretty dramatically. So it goes from 10.71 was the best women's result throughout the entire year. And there was the best men's result was 9.69 seconds. That was about 10% difference. And if you look at the 100, 200, 400, I did a little Excel spreadsheet. It's 10.5, 10.1, and 13.4% better. And there were, for example, 10,009 men that outperformed the best woman, but no woman outperformed the best man. And so to me, there are clearly differences there. And when you look at, and I think coming from someone who, there is an eye test to some sports, and I really get excited for the women's soccer team. And I think the women's soccer team, women's gymnastics, you look at it and I don't see a big difference in the competitive levels. But when you watch something like women's hockey and when you watch the WNBA, those women would all destroy me at hockey and at basketball. Like, they would beat me badly. But when you compare it to the men's sports, it is a lot slower paced game. And especially as someone who played hockey and enjoys hockey, I look at it and I'm not as good as them, but they wouldn't be able to compare to a men's team. And I tried to find some instance where it was men versus women scrimmaging in an actual competitive setting, and I couldn't find any data on that specifically. But if you look at the overall numbers, they are much higher for men. And the last thing I'll say, just going back to something else you said, that I think my point of I 100% agree that I don't think, even if you just had to dress up like a woman and to play a sport, I don't think most boys would do that. I do think there are some that would, for sure. I mean, we have a lot of different beliefs in people in this world. But the issue that I have with the rules, and you had talked about some of the Title IX rules, but on a high school level, there's Connecticut. There was recently a lawsuit where two women were transgender women were racing. But the problem with that is that there is no regulation in Connecticut, and that's one of 17 states that have no restrictions. And that, again, gets back to me, where if we're going to say that, it gets very tricky there, because these kids, they're under 18. I do think you should be over 18 before you start making a gender transition. That's my personal belief. I'm sure you probably differ on me, but I think we're not fully formed yet in our development, and that's a huge change. So I think there's some ethical decisions there by saying, well, if you're going to do that, you have to go in hormone suppression treatment, even if you're 14 years old. I don't agree with that, but I also don't like the fact that there's no restrictions, because that means that technically in high school I wouldn't have to do anything. I could just say, okay, I'm going to race, and if I'm better, I may be able to get a scholarship and take that away from someone. And so that's where it gets tricky for me. And I think I'm going to ask you on this, Gretchen, because we had talked a little bit about dance, and I'm interested because dance is one of those sports. And would you call it a sport? I don't mean that. I didn't mean that.
Yeah, I mean, it's artistic in the professional world, but it definitely is a sport in high school because they compete.
Yeah, because I think in general, when you look at one of the advantages that women's bodies have in sports and dancing are that their pelvises are wider and lower, and it gives them better balance than men naturally. So I think a man may go into dance and be at a disadvantage there. But as someone who's a dancer, how would you feel in a situation where someone is transitioning and competing with you? Would you be 100% okay with that? Do you have issues with it? How would you feel as an athlete?
Yeah, the way that dance competitions are set up, usually in group pieces, there are boys and girls within group works. There's no differentiation within group work. However, solos are set up by age group. So girls are competing with boys. Boys are competing with girls. I've never known of anyone transgendered in my personal career to compete. However, I will say that dancers have a joke about guys, because men's bodies are predispositioned to perform better, faster. Their muscles are more athletic than a woman's musculature. I have a few guys that I know that started dancing when they were in college, and they were professionals when they got out of college, and they got jobs right away. So we have a joke about guys. It's like, oh, hey, there's Chad. Oh, hey, Chad, how long have you been dancing? 3 weeks, and you're like, crap, man. It's like you're already able to turn like a top. You can jump 18 feet in the air. Like, I have nothing. Like, I can't do that. So,
Let me just be clear. I've never been able to do any dance ever, so I am not one of those people. I'm the exception
and
to the
here's
rule, apparently.
I'm
But
I'm gonna make a plug. Every guy should dance. Number one, you're surrounded by females constantly. Why would you not want to do that? Number two, you are the literal, everyone looks to you in a choreography project. You're front and center because you're the only guy. There are many reasons why men should dance. And one is because, really and truthfully, as an educator, we know that guys' bodies are able to do things that women's bodies are not able to do. However, I will say this: whenever you are going up against someone in a category when it's just your age, it's a lot more than just how high can you jump and how many turns can you do. It's artistry. There's all these different categories. So a girl that might not be able to do as many tricks can get higher scores in artistry and technique than a man could. Knowing all of that, though, I would even look at how sports in general, when we're looking at college scholarships, and even looking at the way dancers apply for scholarship, there is no male to female when you're going to college either for a dancer. You are going up for a scholarship, and they look at you, they look at rehearsal footage of you, they look at performance footage of you. If you go to competitions, that's great, but it's probably not something that a real college program is going, oh, you won 18 trophies last year? Great, we want you. I'm not downing that. That's just how it is. And I would look at that in the way that college is look at student athletes. I don't think necessarily they're looking at, if you're a track runner, how many trophies you won that year. It's looking at your stats, and it's not looking at your stats compared to the person that you competed with. It's looking at your stats comparable to the stats of the students that they already have. So they're looking at how can you improve their team. So when I read about the girls, the lawsuit, it really confused me. It seemed more petty, and she beat them, so then this was some kind of retaliation. So and then she ended up beating them, or the one of the cisgendered girls beat her anyway. So it showed that even though you may think everyone is different, so someone could have really big feet and long legs and be able to run a lot faster than you with your short little legs, and you're both cisgendered and you're in the same category with your age. So I look at that very similarly. I mean, it is not the same. I mean, when you're looking at the testosterone and the estrogen levels and all that, these things do have a lot of weight onto how you consume oxygen and the blood flowing through your body, and these are all things that actually really do happen. So my thought then goes to, how does a student athlete going through a transition, where do they lie? Where does that kid, where do they live? And like Jess said earlier, sports, just like art and music, are really beneficial to one's mental health. Feeling like you belong somewhere and that you are part of something bigger than yourself is good for your psyche. So I think when we're looking at like high school sports, especially in things like track and field, and I mean, even basketball and things like that, why is someone that identifies as transgender and feels that they are female and they want to compete on a female team, if they are able to do so without issue, what is the issue? Like, why is someone on the other side of the country opposing something that is working for that group? And it should maybe be up to that group. Are you okay with her being here? Yeah. Okay, great. Let's move forward. Instead of saying, no, nobody's allowed to do it. Everybody has to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that's where, like, we've come through this in a lot of our conversations. There is so much gray area. There is so much that we don't know. And to write a blanket statement about something that is so nuanced is not responsible.
Yeah, and I think
Right.
I want to hear your. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, Jess. I would just say quickly. I think the I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I think
Mm,
that what you said about there being differences, and I think there. It's tough for me because if I took steroids, I'm not
right.
going to be able to play at the NFL level. That doesn't help me. But if I was playing against someone in a rec league and someone found out I was using steroids to be better, there would be fights. So that's the thing, I think, Jess, that when you say you're not competitive, I am very competitive. And most
He's very
athletes that I
competitive.
know are very competitive. I remember being 8 years old playing Little League. I was a catcher. I was a terrible catcher. I couldn't catch a ball, but I wanted to wear the gear. And I remember getting in a fight with another 8-year-old catcher in Little League because he said something. And I'm a very competitive person. And so when you say, is everyone okay with it? Obviously they're not. And I think it's partially
Well, yeah.
because because they filed a lawsuit. And two, the bigger thing here is people are losing out on potential scholarships. And that's the whole thing. And that's the
I
debate
wonder
comes
how
in
though.
where,
Like I haven't seen anything having to do with people losing scholarships.
well, for example, those women, that's what the whole lawsuit was based off of. And I'm not saying they definitely lost scholarships, but when you don't win those kind of competitions, that can affect your skill. And I think the one thing, just to be clear about what I'm saying there, is that is a little bit of still the future to it. But I'll give you one
Mm-hmm.
example. This is a good example from a college level. There was a runner, and then I'm just going to, I didn't mean to do this now, so I apologize for throwing something else in here. But there was a runner, CC Telfer. This is also posted on the website, but CC went through 3 years of playing Division II men or running Division II men's outdoor track and field, ranked 200th and 390th in 2016 and 2017 in the 400 meter hurdles, and then she transitioned and did the 400 meter hurdles for the women's and won the national title that year. She finished up at a 57.3 second pace. The number two person was at 59.21. And that's where, again, even let's get rid of scholarships. That's something where if I can understand the woman being upset. There wasn't a big uproar. Everyone was kind of quiet about it. But if I was that second place finisher and I saw someone who had run and done poorly against men for 2 years of college athletics and then transitioned to a woman and just destroyed everything I've been working my whole life for. I hope that, and even if you don't agree with it, I think it's nice to be able to recognize that that could be frustrating for someone who is a
Oh,
competitive
sure.
person who did
Oh,
work their whole
sure.
life. And so
Yeah.
that's where, and I think the last thing I'll say here quickly on that is that there aren't a lot of examples, but there aren't also a lot of transgender women, but it seems to be transgender women in sports. But when you look at their records, they do pretty well. So it's a pretty high percentage of the transgender women who do well in the sports they play in. So Jess, we just talked about a lot, and I'm sure I have a lot to push back on. So hit us, hit me especially. I think you probably agree with Gretchen, but
Well,
Mm.
I guess the thing I would think that competitive people should understand really well is that there's probably always going to be someone faster, stronger. Always an opportunity that you're going to lose.
Yep.
And I guess that's what irritated me so much in the caster situation. It's sort of like those women who sort of said, well, is she really a woman? It's like, just because they happen to run against her and then they get to throw a fit about like what they've worked so hard for all their lives. Like in all of our lives, we work so hard for things that sometimes happen and sometimes don't. And I hate that we are so focused in on gender that we sort of forget the context in which all of this stuff happens. It could have been, I mean, I know it wasn't any other girl, like it was Caster, or in the other circumstance, it wasn't any girl, it was Cece, did you say? But
CC Telfer, yeah.
but it's just like there's so much that's left to, so much about competing is about chance. And I think that there are some people talk in this context about like Michael Phelps having
Oh, yeah.
feet that are shaped in a way that helps him move faster.
Yeah.
And a couple of other like is it Simone Biles, who I think has like
Mm.
double jointedness, and it's
Yeah,
like
and they
in
actually told her she wasn't allowed to do certain moves
moves.
because they were too hard. People couldn't do them. So yeah, and these are the things exactly that I was thinking about.
There
Yeah.
are individual variations in people's bodies that at that, especially at that elite level,
Hmm.
make them so good at what they do.
Yeah.
It just feels so reductive to be like testosterone is the definitive thing. And I do understand like the different levels, the ranges, the averages. I do understand all of that.
Hmm.
But we don't tell Michael Phelps that he has to swim with weights because his feet are shaped differently or
Yeah,
different
or to get
sizes.
surgery to change his feet.
Yeah. And so I guess what I would ask you, Ray, is like, what is the testosterone difference and the sort of speed difference and the performance difference? Like, well, I wanted to ask you, what does that have to do with the conversation about transgender girls, especially at the high school level? But I guess you just answered it with the last example that you gave. I guess my sort of, it doesn't seem like there are so many transgender girls that it's gonna like, that it's
Blow it up.
gonna, yeah, that cisgender girls are gonna be sort of, cisgender girl sports are sort of gonna be taken over by trans girls. And I think that the cost of those bills that single people out who are already particularly vulnerable to bullying and to discrimination. Trans individuals have experienced a lot of discrimination when it comes to employment. And the same is true of bullying among kids in schools for all LGBT folks, but that they're so vulnerable to that already, that sort of saying, I think the laws go back to making a distinction again between sort of like, what is a real woman? A real woman is a cisgender woman. And the exclusion of transgender girls from girls' sports would just sort of exacerbate that. And I think it's kind of meant to exacerbate that. So yeah, I really worry about the cost. I mean, I think we all have to face kind of individual disappointments, the kind of which are often a result of competition. But I think that transgender young people, especially girls, as a group, face so much discrimination and bullying that inclusion that Gretchen was talking about in terms of like having a place to belong is really, really important for them. So that's really what I worry about, I guess.
I wonder too, like how do we fix that? Like how do we, because there's so little people actually that it's affecting, what do we do with those kids? Like, should we force them to, even if they're going through a transition, to compete against people that that they don't identify with? And then that's a mental issue that they will have to then deal with. And like, that's where I kind of am falling in the whole thing. It's mental for me, because I can't even imagine what it's like already to go through realizing that you want to, or you're needing to transition, and you're having this moment in your life where you're realizing this, and then on top of it your school is telling you that you're not even allowed to be a girl. Like, I can't imagine like waking up tomorrow and somebody going, "You're a man," and I'll be like, "No, I'm not," and having to change my entire course of my like existence because somebody's telling me of who I am when I'm not.
I think cisgender people don't understand that, though.
Yeah, I can't. It's something that I just can't wrap my head around.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, I had a really a deep conversation with a friend of mine who's Black, who was affected by some of the recent things that have happened. And every time I talk with my friends who are Black, I get a better understanding of what people who are Black go through. And I still don't. I mean, obviously, I don't understand it, and so I'm not a transgender person, so I don't understand that either. But I think if you dumb down both of what we're talking about, it's for you, Jess, and correct me if I'm wrong, the fundamental issue is inclusion, which I'm all for. And that's what when we started out, I think I don't have a good solution. But I do think it's really tough because like you said, Gretchen, what do you say? Just don't play. I don't think that's fair.
That's not
but at
fair.
the same time, I think on the other side of it, the fundamental issue coming from someone who is unsure about this, it's fairness. And I think that's the part when bringing up, like, I was listening to a good podcast about this, and one of the women on there who was against transgender athletes brought up a good point because someone said, well, people are taller. I will say that again, I'm 6'4", and you could find a lot of 5'2" basketball players that whoop me. I'd say that anyone on
Sure.
like a high school team would destroy me. So there's
Sure.
a combination of, Michael Phelps by himself, he, I think it was at 6,000 calories or 8,000 calories a day and 8 hours of training. There's so much that you have to do on top of if you really want to be a top athlete.
Yeah.
So there's more
Yeah.
than just feet size, but it is an advantage.
Yeah.
But the difference is being tall. You can see someone if you ever Google videos of Manute Bol, he was one of the tallest NBA players of all time,
Yeah.
and he was also so uncoordinated. It was just funny to watch him play because he was just not good. But a really great person in general. But that doesn't necessarily equate to it. But the problem, and this is where this was the example I heard, was if you look at like a NASCAR race, you can have different bumpers and different tires, and you can change those kind of things, but you would never expect to see an F1 race car on the same course as a NASCAR race. You can't have different chassis. And that is to understand where people are coming from who are saying this is a fairness issue. Your body is going to be bigger. Your body is going to have more muscle mass. There are all these things that are biological differences. And I think that's the part that gets tricky. And like I said, I'm not someone who says, all right, don't play and stay out of it. I would like to find a solution where everyone can play. But I do understand. And I think that's the thing where with guys, like I said, every time I've seen a guy, a woman, whether she was a transgender woman or a transgender man or just a woman who wanted to play male sports, some of my most far right friends are posting, let's go, let's see this. There was the woman who was a kicker for Vanderbilt, I think it was this year, and my friends were posting and saying, let's see this, let's get it up there. And of course, you always have the internet trolls. You always have them that put her down. But in general, people are really excited about that. And if there was a woman who could play in the NBA, she would be a superstar. Like she would be, even if she was playing at the very base level and a bench warmer, she would be a hero because that is a high threshold to cross. And so for guys, I mean, and even when you're playing on teams, if you're playing just pickup games and a woman comes and can ball, you're going to be impressed with her. You're not going to kick her out and say, get out of here, you're terrible. You're going to pick her for your team because you want the best people on your team to play. And I think that's the part that gets tricky for me because when you go into the women's sports, and again, forget about my example about the scholarships, if that hasn't happened yet. I think to me, it's not that it's not happening a lot. It's if that one woman to me who has worked her whole life and it's taken from her, I can understand why she's upset. And that doesn't lead to a solution. We still need to figure out what the solution is. But I think that goes back to, I do think there's a giant advantage for testosterone. And I do think that's a battle, especially in the states that have no laws. And if you just want to identify, you can switch, because the woman who switched in college, it wasn't like she had been raised her whole life. She decided in college, and it happened to lead to an NCAA championship. And I don't know, like I said, as a competitive person, I can 100% see how that was frustrated. But my question to you, Jess, is do you see some kind of middle ground? Because you don't want to use the separate but equal, the rule and say you can have your own league. First off, there's not enough transgender women to have their own sports. So that's not a real solution for me. Is there a solution you see or something you've thought about other than having transgender women who have higher testosterone levels or have some kind of physical advantage compete against women or biological women? Or are you think it's good the way it is?
I guess I just struggle with it doesn't seem like that's even the conversation. The conversation doesn't even seem like it's about like finding that middle ground that you're proposing, where there's some kind of balance or there's some kind of flexibility, where the needs of everyone involved are taken into account. It seems to me, and I guess this is why I really see this as a kind of a political maneuver. It seems to me that the conversation is sort of like, whatever it says on your birth certificate, like that's what you got to do. And that's just going to be deeply uncomfortable for transgender young people. And it's going to lead to them not participating in sports. And so I guess, I don't really know what the middle what the solution is. I was devastated by the decision that affected Castor because it also doesn't seem fair. I mean, as much as the women in Berlin had been training their whole lives to lose that race to Castor, Castor has also trained her whole life. And it's all she's ever wanted to do is run. And so, yeah, it really seems unfair to say that intersex and transgender athletes can't participate unless they sort of follow that birth certificate, because it's just a real trigger for a lot of transgender people I know in terms of, wanting to be who you are.
Yeah.
So I guess I wish the conversation was more like what you're asking, sort of like how do you maintain fairness? How do you sort of ensure that everybody gets equal opportunity? Because that's what, Title IX was supposed to be about anyway.
Right.
How do we do that? But it doesn't seem like we have the political will to do that.
Yeah.
Is what.
Well, and I think I think what you're saying is right on. And I think these are the kind of discussions. I think at the very baseline, I hope you understand a little more about where I'm coming from. And I just want to be clear. I'm not an expert in women's sports. I'm doing a lot of this research as we go. But one of the things I think is even in what you just said there, when you talk about Castor Semenya, I think she is a unique example as well, because I think when you talk about transgender women in sports, people typically think about men who transition to women, whereas someone like Castor Semenya, she was born with, from what I understand, it was still XY chromosomes, but she has internal gonads that produce testosterone. That's pretty rare. There's all kinds of different studies, but I saw it as low as 0.018%. So that's something where if her story was explained that way, I think there would be a lot more people that get behind the fact that, okay, well, that's the way she was born and she can't change that. And that's where the conversation stopped. And I think that's where on both sides, I think, and some people get really upset that I just said both sides, but I think that you're right. On the right, it tends to be, well, whatever's in your birth certificate, that's it. And there's no conversation. I don't want to have this conversation. And on the left, I think part of it is, and I think this is interesting because you haven't played competitive sports and gone through that and you hate competitiveness. And I totally understand why, if you didn't have that kind of drive, you'd kind of err towards the side of, well, just let everyone play, because I think that's the core of it. I mean, I would love to see everyone play. But when you have that competitive side, I mean, I could go through a list of hundreds of times in my life that I should be extremely embarrassed by the way I reacted in sports or in life or in general, just because I overreacted to losing. But people who have that competitive drive, I don't think that is recognized sometimes on the other side, where there is, and I think the other part of it is there are biological differences, and eventually maybe those will go away. But when you look at how much testosterone actually does help, even there was one study, and this is something that, just to bring up one more study, this was done by, this is on the website as well. It's linked. This was actually on NBC News. They had, on their NBC Out page, they talked about trans women who, for the first 2 years after starting hormones, trans women were able to do 10% more push-ups and 6% more sit-ups than their cisgender female counterparts. And after 2 years, they were fairly equivalent to the cisgender women. Their running times declined as well, but 2 years on, trans women were still 12% faster in the 1.5 mile run than their cisgender peers. And on the flip side of it, this was interesting to me. It was female to male transitions. Testosterone affected the fitness scores of the men they reviewed. Prior to starting hormones, they performed fewer push-ups and had slower running times than cisgender men in the control group. A year into the treatment, though, the differences disappeared, and a lot of times they were actually faster. So not only did they get that advantage, and that's something where I know you'd mentioned that men don't get tested for testosterone, but they do get tested for steroids and like 8,000 different kinds of drugs. People have got knocked for drug abuse for things in their cough medicine and things like you have to be very careful. So there are testings that are done, but it does clearly affect it. And I think that's where too, we have to look at some of the science behind it. And I think it's still early. But the science as of now says that there is a difference and there is an advantage. And that's where I think if we do have more conversations like this, I'd love to have a future conversation where you think about maybe what I said, even if you hate it all, and I think about what you said, and we come back and maybe have a solution sometime. Maybe we can have a follow-up that we come and we form some kind of our own league, and we can make this happen, and we can
We're the
solve
new
the problems of humanity. Yeah. As Michael Scott said in The Office, when he was made a very crude joke about Oscar being homosexual, he said, the company has made it my job to make up for 2,000 years of people being grossed out by homosexuality. And I feel like that was Michael Scott's charge in life. And, we're past that now. People are moving forward. We can have these kind of conversations, and we now can maybe solve this problem and move forward. And I can't believe I just quoted Michael Scott as some kind of, that's a terrible quote.
They still won't let Castor run though. So even though it's naturally produced, they still won't let her run.
So this is where I was kind of thinking too, like, so why can't there just be an asterisk next to the names? Like, not that I'm saying that's just the easy way to fix it. But as a competitive
person, I'm on Castor's side there. If I had an asterisk next to my name, it would mean nothing to me.
No. An asterisk next to the lady that came in second.
Yeah, either one.
You know what I mean? Like, I understand. I'm just saying, like, there could be a solution where everybody's able to compete. There was one of the things that I read that they were talking about, like an asterisk next to your name, like you are this weight, this height, this whatever, and it has like your stats basically next to you. And so you won knowing all this, you won knowing all this, you won knowing all this, or whatever. And you came first, second, third, whatever. The other ones were breaking up into open groups. So open groups would be anyone can compete at this same level, and then they're ranked, first, second, third, whatever. And it's like an chess. Open. Yeah. And so the open group actually made more sense to me. So especially when you're looking at track and field or something like that, where you could have an open level, or even just saying like she's competing in an open level against all these other people, and here's her score. And I think there's obviously, I don't know, because I'm not whatever, but there has to be some way to make it so that everyone can still be involved, still compete and get their scholarships and have the trophy, because that's just what it feels like to me. It's like, oh, you didn't get your trophy. Really? And the funny thing is that's a liberal saying this. Oh, you didn't get your participation trophy today? Which is usually not a thing that liberals say. Usually we're like, we want everyone to feel great.
I will push back on that. There's a big difference between participation trophies. I would throw away, and this isn't a conservative, I hate participation trophies. I will tell you guys, the first trophy I ever won wasn't a participation trophy. It was a trophy that I made up with rules for a tennis-based game that I made up, played with neighbor kids, and won because I wanted a trophy. I look back and I'm embarrassed at my 12-year-old self or 10-year-old self who had my grandfather make me a trophy for winning this fake game that I made up. I hate that I did that, but I do think there's a big difference where you saying that it's a participation trophy. It's not. For people who spend
sure.
People who are elite athletes. Again, there's so much preparation and it's so much, and so that's where it comes in. Yeah. It's where it gets difficult. But I do think
I didn't win my first trophy until last year.
What was your trophy?
Was last year. I won best choreography in one of those competitions, and I have never been involved in one of those competitions, and this was my first try. And I won the choreography award, and they won platinum, which is like high in their level, which is great. But that's only partially me, and I can't take full credit. Good job, Altered Productions Institute of Clarksburg, West Virginia.
Love it.
But no, I totally understand what you're saying, though. I'm not trying to diminish anyone's time and effort that they spend. But I think that's the other part of it whenever people are saying like, well, there's this person and they're better than me, but I should be the winner. But they're better than you. But I should be the winner. But they're better than you.
And I think this is where the big disagreement comes in. And I think I see Jess nodding her head and I'm shaking my head. And I think that's the big disagreement where, again, I am not saying that I think there should be, and I think this is a good, like a conversation, conversations like this are good starts because like I said, I understand more now. And even Castor Semenya, I did not know that she was intersex. I would be, if you ask me right now, based on reading her story, that's one of those things when you talk about Michael Phelps' feet, that is a body trait that she has. And I do think that that is by nature, it's such a low percentage. I don't understand why she is. It's more difficult for me to understand why she is being excluded. And so I think that's where you can find some middle ground and start having these conversations. So
absolutely.
when we wrap up, we always talk about what we learned. And I think that number one is something that I definitely, I feel like I understand more. The fundamental issue is inclusion. That's something that I think is often lost in the conversation when people are talking about this. I feel like it all becomes these political battles, which everything in our life is at this point. But I do think the issue of inclusion, and I do have friends who are trans, and I would never want to see them be excluded because they're trans. And I think it comes down to, again, we can talk about fairness separately, but I think the fundamental issue for me is inclusion. And I'm actually all for some kind of resolution of Caster Semenya case, because she has a body like a biological female, and she has the internal workings partially of a man, and she isn't going to be able to compete at the male level based on her scores. But I don't know, if I had to make a decision right now, if I was the AAAF, I would vote that she could get in. So that would be my choice for her specifically. So that's what I learned this week. Gretchen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think my eyes were open just a little bit by what you were saying about people being more competitive, and because of the way I think, and I want everybody to get the most out of everything that they do. Even just I did kind of put that out of my head. So those people are actually being hurt by not winning, or not getting the highest score in their field. And that has a negative aspect for their mental health. And thinking the way that I think for inclusion of trans kids, and because I'm really more focused on high school kids, because when you get to that's a whole other, elite level is a whole other thing. But my focus is more on children, and the way we navigate for them, understanding that there are definite hurt on both sides, and understanding that there is so much gray area, and it is so hard to say, well, this should just happen either on one side or the other, just because there is so much gray area, knowing that trans kids are going to be hurt by saying they can't compete, and then cisgendered kids are going to be hurt because transgender kids are maybe better than them, and understanding there's a lot of nuances, and everybody is different, and it doesn't, for a lot of times doesn't matter, especially when you're looking at children. So yeah, that's just kind of where I really did have my eyes open to that part of it.
Yeah, and for me, I didn't know the piece about the professional sports being open to women, that they could participate in those. That was really interesting to learn. And also the sort of what Gretchen was talking about, the selection of how people move through a process of competition in different sports. I think it was interesting to learn about that, because I think this conversation does sort of shift from sport to sport.
Yeah.
And I think that this isn't really a thing I learned, but it's the thing I appreciated most about the conversation, is that the emphasis on fairness. I think that is if the conversation would happen in that context, it would be so much better, I think.
Yeah.
For everybody, if we were thinking about like what is the most fair for everybody involved. Yeah, so I really appreciated that emphasis on fairness that you put.
Well, that's good. I was a little bit nervous coming into this that you may hate me at the end of this, so I'm really glad.
That is not our goal, Ray.
I know it's not, but you never know. I have had some interactions where I say things even more mundane than that, and people get really mad at me for it. So I feel I really do appreciate Jess being open and talking about this issue. And I think that, again, moving forward, I think I think there's a lot of discussions to be had about the competitive versus non-competitive sports too. I think that's, when you look at these issues, I think when you talk about non-competitive sports, that's a completely different topic. Sure. And I do want to make sure people feel included, and I want to make sure people feel like it's fair. And I think when I see, again, as a man, I'm kind of an outsider in both of these. As a cisgender male, I'm an outsider in both of these, but I can understand both sides where it's fairness. And to me, that's what it looks
Yeah.
like. It's fairness versus inclusion. And
Yeah.
how do you balance those? And I think that is an important thing for us to
Mm-hmm.
look at moving forward. So maybe we'll have you on the show again when we talk for another couple weeks and figure out the solution to all this. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But we're going to wrap up with one good thing. And so, Gretchen, I want to go ahead and tell your one good thing from the week.
I mowed my lawn yesterday, which made me so ecstatic. And I guess that could maybe be our sponsor for the week as well. Cobalt electric lawnmowers. Get yourself
For those of you just
one.
tuning in, we always pick a sponsor of someone we like. So, Cobalt. I
do
believe that's
enjoy
Lowe's,
my
right?
Cobalt.
Is that
It is a Lowe's one, yeah, and I got it on sale a couple years ago, and it was
Nice.
very exciting. But yeah, I was very. My neighbor 2 houses down, she keeps bees, and so I have to be very careful to not put my mower too low to kill the dandelions. I actually allow dandelions to be in my yard for
Nice.
the bees. Yeah,
Nice.
and they
I like
are
it.
swarming everywhere, and it's great.
Nice. Jess, you have a cool one. I've never heard of this before,
yeah.
but what's your one good thing for the week?
Yeah, so we were talking with some of the LGBT students on campus, and they expressed some feeling of discomfort or not feeling totally safe in their living spaces. And, they live on campus. We want this to feel like their home. So the housing office worked really quickly to put together a floor on a residence hall that would be LGBTQ plus affinity housing, so that you could opt in to live there. It would be co-ed, mixed genders, and that you could live there if you wanted to be part of that community. So
That's wonderful.
I think that's cool, but unfortunately, I have heard of that before. I was talking about the other thing you talked about.
Oh.
Can you? I'm not saying that's not cool, but I'm saying the other thing to me I'd never heard of before, and I think it's pretty cool. So you get 2 good things this week.
Yes, she did.
I went to a dog's birthday party.
Dog's birthday party.
Willow the husky turned 1 years old in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. So I drove my dog 3 hours to Latrobe, Pennsylvania
Wow.
to entertain her for 4 hours. And then drive her
I
back.
love that so
Yeah.
much.
What kind of dog do you have, Jess?
Last year at this time, I was not a dog person.
No, she did
She's
not.
a
yeah.
mix. She's a mix, but she apparently
She's so
resembles
cute.
an Anatolian shepherd. That's what I've been told
Oh,
she looks
cool.
most like.
Cool.
So
I like it.
yeah.
She's beautiful.
I love dogs. If I would have known the 2 weeks to stop the spread would have lasted this long, I would have at least fostered because, I know you're married, Jess. I live alone, and I would love to have a dog walking around this house. But oh well. Next
I told
pandemic,
Ray
I'll
at
get a
some
dog
point
early
he
on.
could borrow one of mine. At the time of the start of the pandemic, I had 3 dogs. And I was like, you can borrow one.
I'm always for dog watching. So, all right. Well, thank you again, Jess, for being on the show.
Thanks,
really
Jess.
appreciate it. Gretchen, thanks as always.
Thank you for
look
having
forward
me.
to. I'd love to have you back again soon. So that's going to be it for us this week. We are going to wrap up this week by talking about what's coming up in the future. Next week, we have a TBD episode coming, so we haven't picked the topic just yet. We're narrowing it down for a couple things. But in 2 weeks, if you had heard the news about church membership dropping in the U.S. below 50% for the first time ever, we have Michael Gunger coming on. Michael Gunger was part of a Christian band named Gunger. And at a certain point, he left the church, and it kind of caused an uproar because he was a Grammy-nominated artist, very popular in the Christian arena, and now he's a spiritualist, and we're going to talk to him about leaving the church. And Gretchen, unfortunately, won't be able to make that episode. She's doing some side projects that day, but Caitlin, who was on the show with us for prison reform, is going to come back on. So Caitlin is a pastor. She's a liberal person in general, but she's a pastor. Michael Gunger has grown up in the church and then left the church. I did not grow up in the church and started going. So we have all these different backgrounds going into this episode, but I think it's going to be very interesting. So that's coming up in 2 weeks. So feel free to share this podcast. We have it on researchnews.com, researchnews.org, and also on Facebook Live. So thanks once again for being part of this, and we will see you again soon.